Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last in a series of discussions built around essays in the book, We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style. These discussions have been co-hosted every month beginning in May of this year by the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, the New Press, and Dissent magazine. If you're not already a subscriber, you can use the link in the chat to receive 25% off of your subscription. The people who have organized these discussions, who I will acknowledge at the end of the night, will be working together to bring you more democratic socialist educational events in 2021. So stay tuned. In the meantime, if you missed the previous discussions, look for the links in the chat box and you can catch up on those. Tonight, our focus is on Darrick Hamilton's chapter in the book We Own the Future, which is on the topic of racial and economic justice. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by DSA's Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, also known as AFROSOC, Haymarket Books, and DSA's Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, the DSLC. Before I introduce the panelists for tonight's discussion, I'm sorry to announce that Kinga Yamada-Taylor will not be able to join us for tonight's event. She sent a message with her regrets and apologies that the weather has created complications that will prevent her from participating. So fortunately, the rest of our panelists have weathered the storm and are here with us tonight. So let's go ahead and get started introducing them. So first, we have Darrick Hamilton. Darrick is a Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. He is also a member of the Marguerite Casey Foundation and partnership with the group Health Foundation's inaugural class of Freedom Scholars. He has served as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force and testified before the Joint Executive Committee on Policy Responses to COVID-19 pandemic-induced health and economic crises. Welcome, Darrick.
Thank you.
Next, we have Femi Táíwò. Femi is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He works on ethics and social political philosophy with an emphasis on figures and questions from anti-colonial thought and the Black radical tradition. Welcome, Femi. And we have Simone Baptiste. She's a director and writer-producer based in Los Angeles. Her short directorial debut, $16,000, tackled reparations through a socialist lens. The film was backed by the DSA Fund, won the Jury Award for Best Narrative Short at the 2020 Bushwick Film Festival, and the Best Comedy Short at the 2020 Queens New York World Film Festival, as well as, the Best Narrative Short at the 2020 Pan-African Film Festival. So lots of awards. It's a great film if you haven't already seen it. Simone's also a member of the DSA Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus and is an advocate for marginalized voices. Welcome, Simone. And last but not least, I'm your moderator. My name is Bianca Cunningham. I'm a director of the Democratic Socialists of America Fund Board, a staff organizer for Labor Notes, and a co-founder of the Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus of the DSA. I'm so happy to be with you all tonight. So I'm just going to say a little bit about how we're going to organize the conversation tonight. The first half, about 30 to 45 minutes, will be a discussion generated by questions that I ask the panelists as a moderator. And then the last 30 or 45 minutes, the panelists will answer questions that you ask in the Q&A. So please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We're going to use the chat box to make comments. So to each other and ask technical or logistical questions, but if you do have a question, please, please, please ask in the Q&A box on the bottom. It will be open the whole time, the Q&A box, and someone will be keeping track of the questions. So if you're on social media, you can also ask questions from there and somebody will be flagging them there. We're wanting to get to as many of your questions as possible tonight, so we've asked the panelists to limit their discussion, or their responses rather, to no more than 3 to 5 minutes. So without further ado, let's get into it. So There's a lot of talk lately, or maybe not lately, since forever on the left, about the dynamics between race and class, and whether or not democratic socialism is compatible with a Black radical tradition or vice versa. I wonder if you could each begin by describing what drew you to the fight for a democratic socialist vision of racial justice that's in relationship to economic justice. So we can start with you, Darrick.
So they're not separable. I think if we really want to understand the iterative relationship between economic and political consolidation at the top, one has to understand the ways in which populations are othered and subdivided in order to create that type of system. So, I would say that some of my colleagues on the left that try to summarize all of the despair and inequality as being class-based really missed the boat. I mean, how do you get somebody like Donald Trump, who's able to get 70 million Americans to vote for him, when his signature policy was a tax cut for the wealthy? Well, he offered the codification of whiteness as what he ran on. And if we don't understand the integral pillar role that race plays in the relationship of economic concentration, then we're missing the boat. That if we don't recognize that white privilege offers material and psychological benefits that are real, then we're missing the boat. They're immoral, but they're real. So a democratic socialist agenda presents a viable policy alternative that can mitigate some of the premium that would be attached to identity politics by offering people economic security, by offering people a base level of resources so they have authentic agency in their lives. Then you mitigate some of the desire to be, at least I'm not Black, to be, at least I'm not the first fired or last hired in an economic downturn. In other words, make sure everybody has a job. That's my thinking and my evolution of why I'm drawn into it.
Yeah, Femi or Simone, please feel free to jump in, no particular order. I want this to be conversational, so no need to be formal.
I mean, I agree with everything Darrick presented. We cannot separate race and class. We live under a racial capitalism. And, I think that capitalism's way of, promoting itself to be something that is where you can thrive, where you can achieve greatness, where you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's like a propaganda machine. And I think that we really do need to start having these conversations with people who are the most affected in an economic downturn, have them understand, why they're facing these issues, and then also offering solutions. And I think that obviously socialism is a great solution, but we cannot approach it from a race neutral perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of those points. And to just pick up on something Simone said, the idea of racial capitalism really kind of calls into question why you would even ask, or what you could even mean by, the kind of question that people try to ask, is it race or is it class? At the end of the day, there's just the society that we live in and how that society is organized. And since capitalism got started, it's always been racially organized, and relationships to production or all these other things have always been racially stratified. And how they've been racially stratified or what the categories are might change depending on where and when you are, but that's been a basic fact. So I think, that's the place to start from.
Thank you to you all. So it's interesting to hear how you all come to this work, and I'm sure people are interested to know that. So Darrick's chapter in We Own the Future summarizes the primary goal of racial and economic justice as shared prosperity within an economic rights frame. We talk a lot about how we need an additional economic bill of rights, and that we need universal programs that are administered in a race-conscious way. How do you explain to others what gets in the way of realizing this goal? whether it's messaging, or is it neoliberalism, is it racial capitalism, the racial wealth gap? What stops us from being able to understand and carry the two things together? The Economic Bill of Rights, universal programs administered in a race-conscious way. What are the biggest obstacles to seeing that goal through right now?
All of the above that you named. I mean, the racial wealth gap means that Black people don't have economic might, and that's about power. You know, the system of neoliberalism, as Simone described, is inclusive of a propaganda machine that has perpetuated a narrative that if government intervenes on the behalf of people, all they're doing is creating perverse incentives to lead to immoral and bad behavior, right? This notion that markets are fair, efficient, colorblind, that's part of a capitalistic rhetoric that says that government interventions on behalf of people only deter us away from those efficient good uses, right? That's propaganda, right? That is grounded in a dogma, a belief, a faith that somehow that's how markets operate. And markets are a political construction. And you know, I'll try to say this point also, I don't even think it's accurate to call it capitalism per se. To me, capitalism is a concept taught in economics 101 or taught in an academic domain. And perhaps some of my panelists will push back on me on this point, but what is actually practiced is more of a political economy rhetoric that in some ways puts markets up as this straw man, but we don't even realize that. You know, we intervene in ways throughout our political economy that favors usually the wealthy, firms, and elite in a way that frankly is not grounded in capitalism. But the larger point, the main point is that what people need is a base level of resources in order for them to have authentic agency in their lives. So to me, democratic socialism is about ensuring that people aren't homeless, ensuring that people have a basic income, have a job, have healthcare, have the base necessity that they need to thrive. And so, so the biggest obstacle is capital itself, right? Those at the top, they don't, right? They stand to lose. So I know you want short answers and I'm rambling on. I'm gonna say one last point and I'm gonna stop a little bit, which is who benefits from racial stratification, right? And who benefits from this racialized capitalism, if that's what we want to call it? Who benefits from it? Clearly the wealthy class benefits. Clearly the wealthy class benefits from labor being fragmented and not being able to unite and collectively fight against them. Who suffers from it? Black people. Black people are othered, and you know, that's the US context. We can come to other contexts and talk about other people that are othered, and there are other ethnicities in the US that are othered also. But Blackness seems to be the anchor in the US context. So there's no question they suffer as a result of this racialized capitalism. What is ambiguous is the white working class. And on the one hand, there could be benefits if there was a broader labor coalition. But on the other hand, if there's an authentic labor coalition, they would have to give up white privilege. They would have to give up some of the, again, immoral benefits associated with your ethnicity having transactional value. So that's not an easy ask, but there are alternatives that could diminish that value, such as common humanity, dignity, collective efficacy. These are not pie in the sky values. These are humanistic values. So the biggest obstacle is a structure that pits us against each other and codifies the property rights and whiteness.
Let me give I agree with what I agree with a lot of what Darrick's saying. One thing I would put differently is, look, I think at the bottom, you have to ask, you know, do white people benefit, or even non-Black people, non-Indigenous people, do they benefit, you know, in general, or do they benefit within this system? Right. So if you compare how well they're doing to Black and Indigenous people, then yeah, they benefit. But, you know, look at the world Darrick just described, right? A world with a job guarantee, a world where everybody has safe, guaranteed housing. That's a better world for everyone. It's not just a better world for Black and Indigenous people. And I think at the bottom, you know, it's something other than capitalism in the straightforward dollars and cents way. And I think this is kind of what Darrick was getting at in the middle of what he was saying, because I think at the bottom of an approach to life and politics that would reject giving everybody housing and giving everybody a job guarantee and giving everybody safety and security, you know, there's a culture that just doesn't believe that we can be on the same team, right? There's a culture that has normalized conflict, that has normalized antagonism. The United States has spent over 90% of its years at war, either fighting wars of settler conquest or wars of imperial conquest. And that's, you know, external politics. That's not even talking about the slave patrols that became police departments. The United States' culture is built on taking and keeping what has been taken through violence. And the culture that gets built out of that has just forgotten how to approach life or approach politics in any kind of collaborative way. And I think at the bottom of that is where you're going to get an understanding of, you know, why you get Trumps and why you can't get Bernies, right, in this culture. And I think we got to contend with that.
I mean, I feel like
sorry.
yeah, everyone's like covering it. I would just say, to add on to this, you know, calling out capitalism as being an agent in the, you know, terrorizing of communities and the stratification of society, that's a threat to call that out. And I think that, you know, the idea of, you know, I mean, I'm looking back at the actual question because it's been so long since you asked it, Bianca, but the administering of economic rights through a race-conscious way, you know, I think capitalism only works because it's a race towards the bottom and we have to fight over resources, and calling that out is essentially, you know, a threat. And I don't think that, you know, there is a push to change things truly, because to change things, you would have to topple the whole system.
Bianca, can I say something about race conscious, the choice of that word?
Please.
So the word to me evolved from, you know, I love John Powell's work, but I don't like targeted universalism as a phrase. I thought that, you know, the argument of inclusive, but making sure we're targeted, I got where it was coming from, but I evolved to say, let's be explicit and say race consciousness in it. Subsequent to writing the chapter, I think we need to even go further, and I like the phrase that Ibram Kendi has been promoting and getting a lot of attention to, which is anti-racist. I think that's even a better way of saying it than race conscious. And I didn't have that vocabulary at the time. But I think the point is, one, given our history and where we are, there's no such thing as race neutral. To think that any of our structures, which have been advanced in a direct, targeted way, both in intervention as well as design, explicitly racist, to think that we can start any socialist policy or any economic rights policy and think that we can just do it in a race neutral way is a misnomer. So I think we have to say, yes, everybody should be included, but we should ensure that when we do it, it is by design and implementation inclusive of all races, all ethnic groups, and all genders. So explicitly anti-racist and anti-sexist in its design and implementation.
Thank you for elaborating on that. Yes, definitely. And I think I agree with that phrase as well. I prefer that. Okay, so let's go to the next question. The title of your essay, Darrick, is A Three-Legged Stool for Racial and Economic Justice. The three legs are federal jobs guarantee, baby bonds, and reparations. And if we have time, we'll get to all three, but let's start with reparations since it's something that everyone on this panel has written about. How would you summarize the Democratic Socialist case for reparations? And what could or should it look like or not look like? I know that many of us in AFROSOC caucus have been on the other side of arguments with ADOS about what a democratic socialist vision of reparations is compared to what they are articulating. There are a lot of people that agree with their articulation. It seems like there is a lot of like tests about who is Black, what is the Black community, you know, how can we measure oppression, et cetera. So I really want us to break it down. What do we mean as democratic socialists when we talk about reparations? What would that look like for us?
And look, I damn sure can't speak for all democratic socialists. So let me state that out right. What I say might not be representative of everyone. But let's start with reparations has to be grounded in morality. So people may disagree on approaches, and those debates are healthy as long as they're grounded in morality. Reparations is about justice. It's about, there are two key phases. One is the acknowledgement, and the other is the reparative part, the restitution, or the reparative part, the money. Thank you. So both are necessary. Both are necessary and important. So we need to recognize and acknowledge that long history of both design and implementation, from beginning when Blacks were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class, but even beyond that, when Blacks were exploited from and extracted from in both economic, political manners of their resources, and then here's the other part, as well as their bodies. They're literally their bodies, right? There has to be a full-throated acknowledgement if we are ever as a nation going to get beyond race. And the benefits of that acknowledgement extend well beyond Black people. You know, Femi was talking about a culture that has developed from our history. You know, it's an immoral culture. It's a blight. It's a blight that we can't see beyond war, taking, selfish accumulation that knows no bounds without thinking about brotherhood. That's not good. That's not healthy. So reparations, the cleansing, and you know, this ain't pie in the sky. That's right. There's something about that acknowledgement, the truth. There's something about the truth that of the reconciliation that is important. And not only does it fight those narratives that have described Black people as lazy, inept, ignorant, welfare queens, deadbeat dads, but those are the same narratives that we use to describe poverty in general. We racialize poverty. We racialize poverty with anti-Blackness that becomes fodder for describing Asians, Latinx, whites, indigenous populations, all. So that authentic acknowledgement is critical as a nation for soul cleansing, but also critical as we go forward in refuting narratives that predicate poverty as being a problem or a product of deficient, defective people, as opposed to what it really is, which is resource deprivation, as opposed to resources and structures, that is what grounds poverty. So that's important whether you're Black, white, or whatever. But then that acknowledgement is empty if you don't have the reparations part, if you don't have the restorative part. Well, you know, we could talk about the racial wealth gap, and you know, the real value of the racial wealth gap is the functional role of wealth, the agency that wealth affords, the economic security, what it can do for you, not the outcome of wealth, but just the agency. That's right, the economic agency. So I'm going to put a button on it and come to a conclusion real quick and just say the most direct and parsimonious approach to address the racial wealth gap, which might be the single most paramount indicator of the implicit racial history that we have. If we were to sum it up in one economic measure, it might be the racial wealth gap. So the most direct and parsimonious way to address that would be reparations. And then the last thing I'll say, I said the last thing is, and this is related to the question you raised about how would it be implemented. We could have the conversation about who would be entitled. Happy to have that conversation, but cash is important, unconditional cash, because it says, do what you want. If you know, the Dave Chappelle joke, you give Black people cash, they'll go out and buy Cadillacs. The problem isn't that they'll go out and buy Cadillacs. If they like Cadillacs, buy a damn Cadillac. The problem is Black people don't own stocks in Cadillac. So you end up with a multiplier accelerator problem where those that own the means of production, and this came out in Symone's video, which I encourage people to go see. If you end up with a problem where if you don't own the means of production or land, as a result of an economic multiplier, you actually could generate more inequality from where you started. So included in reparations, I think cash is symbolic and important, but it necessitates some transfer of either land or the means of production. And that can be done. The US government could redistribute stocks if they so desired.
Thank you, Darrick. Yeah, so you mentioned Simone's short on reparations, and we talked about all the awards that it's won. So Simone, I wonder if you want to jump in here and talk about what your vision was and working on that, and what it is in general about reparations that is inspiring you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Darrick, for watching it. That's really cool. Yeah, the idea behind it was simply to debunk a lot of the things that our mainstream dialogue around reparations, which is, oh, well, if it's a check, then of course you'll spend it on, you know, sneakers or something. And I want to repeat something that Darrick said, like, cash is not wealth. I think that we do have to think about reparations beyond the check, and think about structural change that we can be demanding, and of course, including land ownership. But of course, I walk that back slightly only because I feel after doing so many of these panels this year, what has been brought up to me is that we are stolen people on stolen land. So I do want to echo the need for a multiracial coalition in this fight for reparations. Native people have received many, many checks, but it hasn't made their community whole. And so we can learn from each other, of course, and start crafting what our demands should be. And of course, making sure that it doesn't just boil down to a check. And so here in California, Gavin Newsom signed a bill similar to HR 40, in which, we're going to look into reparations. But I think what I like about that bill, the author actually has the same kind of framework where, not looking at it as just a check, but trying to figure out what other things we can do. And so hopefully it doesn't get distilled down or, diluted from there. But I think the intent is there, and it's appropriate for the times that we're in. And I think that there are countless demands for reparations beyond just US slavery. And so we have to also broaden out, what reparations would look like for example, Haitians in our, ICE detention centers, or what would reparations look like for, many people who have suffered at the hand of capitalism under this government. So I have a more Pan-African approach to reparations. I'd prefer to see a global reparations for a global crime of slavery. And, I'm wondering how that can be framed so that we're not excluding other Black people in this country when we figure out what we're doing with reparations.
Thank you. Femi, go ahead. And, you brought up HR 40, so I'll just add in there that there's been no movement with HR 40. And so maybe we can discuss that. And then I've seen these moves in local governments to pass what Simone was just talking about. So do we see that as that being a way to have movement around this issue, since there is none on the federal level, it seems? And you can also answer the other question too, Femi, sorry.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with the first question, but just to say something quick about that, I think the domestic and the global version are compatible, right? I think if you're talking about what to do, like as a matter of US policy about US citizens or something like that, some kind of framework looking inward, then yeah, it makes all the sense in the world to concentrate reparations on African-American descendants of slavery, because the crime of slavery was concentrated on their ancestors, right? But the United States is also an empire, right? So it's, and slavery was part of imperial conquest. And so, the kind of global question about what to do about slavery and what to do about reparations also has an international dimension. So I think we can and should just do both of those things. And, I think the distinction Darrick made between just cash or cash plus, right? Cash, means of production, land, that kind of thing is important. It runs into what Simone brought up, right? This is stolen land. But that can be the start of a conversation rather than the end of one, right? So, as Simone said, we can learn from other people, but also not just learn from them. So the Republic of New Africa was a Black nationalist group that demanded reparations, and specifically demanded the opportunity and resources to start a new nation, but to do so in negotiation with indigenous people. So it wasn't, the US owns this land and they're going to give it to us. It's the US has a bunch of stolen wealth, they're going to give that to us, and we're going to talk to indigenous people and come to some kind of agreement about how to share this land. That's a different framework, and I think it's a better framework from the standpoint of solidarity, and I think that's something we should keep in mind. Last thing I want to say before I shut up, and I think this gets to what Bianca's question was about, or provocation. I think what this has to look like in concrete terms is going to have to deal with the cash question, is going to have to deal with the local, national, international question. But I think one thing it's really going to have to deal with is the climate question, right? If land gets ceded to Black Americans and is underwater in 30 years, to me, that's not reparations, right? Or if, Black people get a check, Black Americans get a check, but, 20, 30, 40 years from now, police violence is what it looked like during Hurricane Katrina, because climate change has deteriorated politics so much. I think that's also a problem. So I think we shouldn't just be looking backwards at the racial wealth gap of today as the inheritance of yesterday's racism. We also got to anticipate tomorrow's racism as well, right? And so the forms of reparations that we're demanding should keep that in mind. So I think it's going to start with the things Darrick's talking about, but we also got to think about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and those kinds of things.
I'm so glad that you brought up the climate crises, because it brings us to the next question. I mean, I oftentimes think about, we talk about federal jobs guarantee, which is another leg in the three-legged stool. I also go back to this climate crisis because I think that they are, there's a way to intertwine both of them. So the chapter that Darrick writes, it recommends prioritizing the most distressed communities and infrastructure needs, including human infrastructure like childcare, elder care, and other forms of care for people, along with care for the environment and care for the community. So how can this campaign, first of all, where is this campaign at for a federal job guarantee. I oftentimes don't hear a lot of people talking about it, so I wonder if we could talk about where the campaign is, where it's active, and also like what it's doing to convince more people that employment can be a right and an economy, and we can have an economy based on human needs rather than profit. We can start with Simone maybe this time, since we've been starting with Darrick.
I am the wrong person to start with this one. I do not like labor, so like even the idea of a jobs guarantee, I'd rather be on my couch at home. But I would say, when I think about federal jobs guarantee, I also think about UBI as complementary for artists, especially because I think that we strip a lot of the, cultural aspects of our society away when we are forcing people into a 9-to-5. I think that we should prioritize funding the arts for sure. And if that means UBI for artists or people who want to pursue higher education, people should be able to do that. And so I'm trying to disconnect, the idea that you need to work to live, because there are other aspects of, just human existence in itself. There are other aspects of human existence outside of work. So, but I did like this chapter, and I'm not dissing federal jobs guarantee. I just wanted to add that in. But I love being at home for quarantine. I'll say that. Okay.
That's real. Thank you for that. Darrick, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and also real quick, shout out to Robert Brown, the economist who inaugurated a review of Black political economy. A lot of the stuff around reparations, like the notion that it has to go beyond cash and think about capital, is his idea, and we should pay homage to our elders. And also, I promise to be quick on the other debate, but the local initiatives, those are useful, valuable, and symbols matter. But at the end of the day, the federal government is mostly culpable, and the federal government has the purse strings, the power of the purse, to actually bring about reparations. And if we're thinking about putting pressure on the Biden administration, there's HR 40, which would be useful coming from Congress, but Biden can commission by executive order a commission to study the issue. So he doesn't need congressional power to do so. So we can use the executive power to push forth reparation. I think that's important to think about and know. And then later we could talk about who's entitled. That's a whole nother thing. But let me get to this one, right? So the federal job guarantee, the beauty of it is, not only does it ensure that everybody who desires a job actually has a job, it also allows us to make decisions on where we want productivity to go. So we can have a green economy. If we're thinking about international, we can employ Americans in a Marshall Plan for the world if we want to. We can reimagine and define the society that we want by using public works to build it. Public works is not exclusionary of art, but inclusive of art. If we look at the New Deal precedent from WPA, a lot of the artistic monuments that exist today are the result of federal interventions with direct hiring. I mean, even now when we start, again, I brought up the Biden administration, and then Bianca, you asked the question of where we are. Federal job guarantees poll very well. And they poll well even when you present it as, people present it as the Democratic Party has an idea to give every American a job and will pay for it with taxes, right? So that's obviously framed in a way to not necessarily solicit high opinions, but yet a plurality of Americans support it across every demographic group you can name. Blacks and Latinx groups overwhelmingly support it. So it is very popular. And there's initiatives in Congress where people are, Bernie Sanders wants the whole can of beans. He's not alone, there are others. But there are at least movements towards thinking about either demonstration. So momentum is building, that's my point. And then, the other point is, if we're thinking about political pressure, there's a lot of conversations around workforce development, around training workers. I think as progressives, we should demand that any of those programs that are enacted at the very least, have a guaranteed job at the end. If we're going to put workers through training and tell them, we're going to, you got to do this, invest in training. If there's no job waiting at the end, that defeats the point. So from a public work standpoint, there should certainly be a job at the end. I got a lot to say about UBI. I support guaranteed income, but UBI is problematic to me because it can be inequality enhancing. If you give a poor person $1, by definition, they will consume it because they're a subsistence population. You give a wealthy person $1, it goes towards their investment fund. So ensuring that every American has adequate income to eliminate poverty and lift families to the middle class, it's all supportive of it. But UBI is one of those that by design is problematic.
I agree. I think that UBI is sometimes used as a way to eliminate, public programs. That's not the type of UBI that I'm talking about, but there are several countries that are piloting different UBI programs. Even up in San Francisco is piloting a program right now for artists. And so I think that we can learn from it. But of course, I'm not about that life of stripping other programs that, impoverished people do need. I just want to know, if there is somewhere, some place that can actually achieve UBI and not strip away other economic rights from people.
Amy, do you want to weigh in on this one?
I think they covered it. Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you all for your thoughtful comments. We're going to move into the second part of our discussion, and that means that we're going to turn the chat box back on in case we have any technical or logistical questions. We're also going to turn to the questions from our friends and comrades in the Q&A. So it's not too late to add more questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or in whichever social media format or platform that you're using. Please let us know what you're interested in hearing more about. So I have one question that's queued. So this question says, Darrick talked about how the vast majority of Americans would benefit from socialist policies. Ibram Kendi, among others, talk about how the history of race and racism is intimately tied with the birth of modern capitalism. Would a socialist system automatically address and dismantle racial inequalities? And if not, how can a system be established in such a way that equality will be protected? That question, I believe, is for anyone or everyone.
I'll jump in real quick unless somebody else wants to go. Right. I think it has to be anti-racist. That's the lesson. The lesson is thinking you could just have universal policies and programs is a misnomer. That by design and implementation, one has to be explicitly anti-racist. And if that's not clear, we can make it clear. An example of a racist universal policy is Social Security itself when it was originally conceived of. It originally excluded domestic and agricultural workers, and that was by design racist. When over 90% of Black women were in a domestic or agricultural position, and over half of Black men, that was intentionally racist. When the Wagner Act still excludes domestic and agricultural workers, that's racist. So if we're doing policies today that are inclusive, then we need to make sure that by design and implementation, we are actively ensuring that everybody is included. I think that's the point.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add, or we want to move on? Cool. So next question, can you all discuss how neoliberalism arose as a response to the challenges made against capitalist domination by groups such as the Black Panthers, Young Lords, welfare rights organizations, etc.?
It certainly arose in response to those, but I think it's important to also tell a global story about it, right? So before the Second World War, the British Empire alone controlled a quarter of the world's surface area and a quarter of the world's population, right? Much of the world lived under, including almost the entirety of the African continent and much of Asia, lived under blatant authoritarianism. that was very explicitly, very explicit systems of racial apartheid, whether we're talking about Kenya or, Rhodesia, as Zimbabwe was called then. So that was much of the world. And then the Second World War happens. A lot of Europe is devastated. And, that's an opening because all the colonial empires are rebuilding after the war. And so a lot of, the number of member states in the United Nations goes up from 35, and it more than triples from 1946 to 1970. So that's the global context in which the Black Panthers and the Young Lords are doing, revolutionary anti-racist politics. It's not just that they're doing inspiring anti-racist politics, but that's happening during a wave of anti-racist movements, a lot of which are taking the form of anti-colonial national movements. They're fighting wars against the Portuguese Empire or the British Empire, or the French Empire, right? That's what's happening. And so neoliberalism is, I think, a response to all of that, right? Neoliberalism is, in this kind of context where there's clash over who these newly independent countries are going to align with. Are they going to align with the United States and the forces of capitalism? Or are they going to align with the Soviet Union and socialism? I think there's an effort to figure out a version of freedom, right? That's the liberal part, that is going to protect the economic interests of the capitalist states and the US aligned states, but it's also going to protect their soft power interests and their political interests in keeping this kind of moral authority, this largely imagined moral authority, but the moral authority they're trying to make real, right? And to find a way of talking and to find a way of governing that's going to be compatible with doing that, and to find a way of making institutions do that work, whether it's the World Bank or the IMF or the World Trade Organization, or et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's the story I would tell about where neoliberalism comes from.
I mean, the racialized aspect, both domestically and international, should not be unnoticed. For example, we had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, which was not grounded in loans with conditions of American companies being able to come in and marketize your economy, but for the rest of the world, we had lending with basically loan pushing and a whole set of conditions that opened them up to predation from American companies, and not just American companies, British companies and the like.
Great, thank you for that. So our next question, I love this, I think it's really good. The question is there an inherent tension between reparative strategies to grow Black wealth, like encouraging Black home ownership, for instance, versus progressive strategies to foster state and community ownership, example, social housing? If so, how do we reconcile that tension?
On the panel, I'm probably the one that uses terms like capitalism and socialism the least. Again, if I'm just blunt, I think a lot of it, those are academic conversations, and that never do we actually practice in purity any of them, that it's always some, and I'm not trying to get this half full, but I actually believe that. And I think that ultimately what we're talking about is economic rights. That's my understanding of democratic socialism. That's what I would call it. And then also, it's not just that, a recognition that that capital needs to be reined in, that unfettered capitalism will do what it does best: iterate, concentrate, and even capture out our political system. So you need structure to rein that in. It needs to be regulated. But that said, ultimately, what we're talking about is assets, and assets can come in the form of private assets or public assets. What assets do is, in perpetuity, they provide a set of resources so that you can have agency in your life. That's what we're ultimately talking about. We're not talking about the outcome, we're talking about the input. So it's the functional role of wealth. And wealth can come in a public domain or it can come in a private domain. For example, we could make a decision and say, public college and universities are going to be tuition free. That's a public asset. And that will, that will be in perpetuity and enrich people's lives. We could alternatively say, we will endow every child with enough resources so that if they choose to go to college, they'll have the money to do so. That's a private asset. Your sensibilities might steer you towards one or the other, and I'm kind of open about that steering. To me, my bottom line is, and it's not going to be all of the same. I imagine all of us might want some mix of the two to some extent, but at the end of the day, how you end up on that mix, I'm open, but we got to make sure that for certain goods and services, that the market is not the deciding mechanism of who gets and who does not get. We should not ration who gets access to healthcare, but based on decisions that result from profit maximizing fiduciary responsibilities as shareholders. We should not ration who has access to a college degree as a result of fiduciary responsibilities to a shareholder. And we could keep going. I won't, but we could say housing, et cetera. There's a set number of goods that should not be strictly rationed by market incentives.
And I'd like to add to that, that well thought out answer. I thought that was awesome. I think at the core of it, reparations is still a redistribution of wealth. I think how that wealth is distributed is still informed by the country we live in and the status quo, like what conditions that we live underneath. However, there are some more socialist demands that we can make that will reinvest into the community as well. I think that defunding the police is an excellent example where it's not just taking money from the police state, but it's also reinvesting in communities. And I think that's like, the combination that we're all hoping for. We don't want to just individually amass wealth, but I think that we want our communities to also be uplifted. And so there is still a happy medium.
The only thing I would add to this is, I kind of want to put the question of, what advice we give to individual people out to one side, or off to one side. But I think there's just another question about, institutionally speaking, what is it that we're trying to build? Because the push for home ownership, there are a lot of political reasons for it, a lot of stuff that historians would know better than I would, and that economists like Darrick would know better than I would. But, I just know the same thing that I think anyone who pays a mortgage knows, which is the bank owns the house, right? And that's part of why the market gets to do this weird allocative work of deciding who, lives on the street and who lives in a house and who lives in an apartment and so on and so forth, right? There's a small class of people that are able to own the property that people need for housing. And because there's a small class of people that are able to own the property needed for housing in a society that organizes housing like this one, there's a small group of people that decide who is housed and who's not. They're bankers, they're landlords, they're capitalists, right? And I think, regardless of what we would say to any individual person in front of us, we could have a problem with that and we could want something different. And there are models for something different. There are community land trusts, right? The housing and land in an area could be held in trust by community, and housing decisions could be made by community people rather than bankers and landlords. And I think these are the things we have to start thinking about, community control in general. But I think it's worth a thought.
Awesome, thank you. So the question is, are there lessons we should be drawing from other national or regional histories about how to theorize about the links between capitalism and race? Are there strategic lessons that as Americans we should be studying?
I mean, we have American lessons about economic rights. So we have periods in which we have been more grounded in putting forth an economic bill of rights, and we know the benefits of it. The problem with that history, the sordid problem with that history, is that Blacks were excluded. And that's part of the explanation for why we want reparations today. So it's hard pressed to find examples of racial inclusion in the United States on a full scale. I mean, we might have had some periods of relative improvement, you know, civil rights period. If we look at the domains of wages and the domains of education, even still with education, there's a narrowing a gap, a persistent narrowing a gap, albeit way too slow. But with wages, Black men in 1940 went from having 40 cents on the dollar as a typical white man to about 70 or 80 cents by 1970. So that was an unprecedented narrowing of a wage gap. Again, not wealth. And then if we look at Black women relative to white women, that's not even the right reference point, because the lived experience of what it means to be a Black woman is not so directly comparable to a white woman. And you know, why not compare Black women to a white man anyway, or any man? So the reference point becomes important. And that's why it was hard for me to cite a statistic like that. But at the risk of rambling on, even in that period that we had some relative progress in certain domains, wealth did not narrow. Wealth actually probably got even larger because of the seeding of New Deal programs that created an asset-based white middle class. And as a result of that narrowing and that policy framework that was racist by design, I think it left us vulnerable to neoliberalism. I think it left us vulnerable to a new class of elite, you know, capitalists or political economists that reacted to the gains of the New Deal by creating these narratives of culture of poverty, deficit Black people, the government tilting the scale in favor of undeserving Black people. Had we done it right and made a New Deal that was racially inclusive, I think we would have been less politically vulnerable to that neoliberal backlash.
I mean, just real quick, I think something to look at, two kinds of things to look at in terms of the relationship to capitalism and learning from other parts of the world. You know, you might look at the kind of post-colonial Black states, especially the Caribbean ones, in terms of how they approached the international world system. I mean, even now, one of the biggest government groups pushing for global reparations is the Caribbean Community of Nations, right? I think there's something to learn about, you know, kind of international state level politics from that. And on a more kind of grassroots insurgent level, I think Black Latin American history, the settlements people made who escaped the condition of slavery. They have different names: quilombos, mocambos, palenques, whatever you want to call them. They created some other way of other community, and provided for their own security, provided their own housing, provided their own agricultural systems. And that's the kind of thinking that we're going to have to do, maybe alongside of, or maybe instead of, the kind of state international sort of thing. So those are things I would tell people to look into.
Awesome. So we're gonna keep it moving. Somebody says they have a question about coalition building. Femi, you recently published a brilliant piece arguing against a popular strategy of paying deference in organizing, education, and other fields, strategies also employed in the DSA. You argue that these are actually reductive and harmful to the people that they seek to foreground. You also claim that this is precisely the most oppressive experience, or the most oppressive experiences that connect rather than divide us. Given that coalition making across racial boundaries seems to me to be decisive for socialism's success in the US, can you say a bit more about how we may envision traumatic oppressive experiences as bridges and political coalition building?
One of the things I think about in this kind of vein, because of, you know, whatever the politics I have, because of the things I think about are wars. And in particular, the kind of politics that some veterans develop, some of whom are in DSA and who are people, you know, you could ask directly about this sort of thing. But, you know, the culture, the country that produces war, that sends people, you know, to go and get physically injured or morally injured, moral injury is a thing, to experience trauma, like the United States, is doing something that I don't think it makes sense to respond to with a hierarchy of suffering, right? If your country is willing to like bald-facedly lie to send, you know, to send people's children into armed conflict to defend essentially private interests in oil and a few, you know, weird war hawk political interests in national security apparatus. You're just not dealing with a good faith institution. And if that's the way that you're thinking about it, then a lot of the kinds of things that we're used to thinking about, like privilege politics, don't really make a lot of sense to me, right? Maybe, you know, I'm sure that the US military is more willing to send, you know, Black recruits into harm's way than whites recruits, but ultimately they send everybody, right? And so I just don't think the kinds of distinctions that we appeal to when we think about privilege are the kinds of things that are going to be generative when we're trying to understand what institutions do or how we should respond to them, right? I think at the end of the day, that's not you know, it just calls back an earlier exchange in the first half of this panel, but it's just, are non-Black people advantaged in this system relative to us? Yeah, but is that the comparison we should be making? Like, what we should believe at the end of the day is that there's a better system for everybody than this, that there's a version of living together that doesn't involve sacrificing a few of us to oil interests or to imperialist interests, that there's a version of living together that doesn't condemn anyone to actually live on the streets or live in the constant fear of having to live on the streets. And what it's going to take to get to that system and what it's going to take to maintain that system is an orientation to thinking about each other not as enemies, not as people who we're in competition with, but as people who are on our team, you know, whether they have the exact same experiences we have or not. And I think, yeah, I think that's fundamental to coalition building, but I think it's just fundamental to politics.
I mean, I think that's brilliant. And you know, the only thing I'll say, and I think it's adding on, which is the point that we need to redefine how we measure economic good to get to the system that Femi's defined it. If it currently stays defined as self-interested economic men that are into promoting their individual well-being, then that accumulation with no bounds will always leave us vulnerable to a tribalism that enhances the value associated with lateral positioning, with relative positioning, with saying, at least I'm not them. So I'm wholeheartedly, and I think you said it extremely well, which is we need to invest in morals, that we need to define economic good in our common humanity. And I might be paraphrasing and saying it wrong, but I'm with you, and I think that's right. The other thing I'll just add on is the notion, and what you say is sobering, hierarchy of suffering. That's sobering. That's painful to hear that we're willing to think about a hierarchy of suffering, not even hierarchy of well-being, but of suffering. And it's accurate. I haven't heard it before, but it's sobering. But we treat people that are subaltern as surplus populations. And one of the ways we deal with surplus populations is we conscript them into our military and send them over to fight battles. And that's part of the hierarchy of suffering.
Okay, so Deepa asks, can reparations be used to heal divisions within the working class? The movement for Black Lives says reparations can happen within institutions, not just at the state or federal level. Could they happen? Does that mean that they could happen within labor unions, for example? And what could labor unions, what is their role in pushing, for this three-legged stool of racial justice that we're discussing tonight?
I think that's really interesting. I just want to baseline reminder, reparations is a reparative justice for a crime that has been committed. So any crime, and any group of people who have faced a crime. And so I guess, everyone can have different demands for reparations based on different crimes committed against them. If there was a crime committed against someone in a labor union, sure, have at it. I think the more broader based crimes are, they have more teeth because you have more people to fight for them, with you. But I think baseline understanding, a lot of people do forget that it's a reparative justice for a crime.
Yeah, it's reparative justice for a crime. I think that's an important way to frame it. But, reparations responds to a crime, but what does it build? Like, what do you do with reparations? And I think the way that you answer that helps answer the question that's being asked. I think if you think reparations is just a check or just making people better off or just an apology, then yeah, from that perspective, it's harder to see how that could be a basis for coalitional organizing. But, I think Robin Kelly makes this point in Freedom Dreams, which people should check out, really important book. A lot of people, especially in the African-American tradition of politics, have thought bigger thoughts about what reparations could and should be. They thought it's not just responding to the crime, but the way that we're going to respond to the crime is by transforming our political institutions, transforming our political way of life into something better, into something more just, into something fairer. And that's just obviously beneficial, again, for everyone, and not just the people who would, as part of that process, get checks, or as part of that process, get land cessation. Everyone's going to reap the benefits of better, more just, and more fair institutions. And I think from that understanding, that's a way that labor unions can be pulled into that fight. There's a mode of organizing that's getting called bargaining for the common good, that workers in, for example, the Chicago Teachers Union or a Minnesota local of SEIU have been acting out and have been showing the way towards, where they're saying you were not just going to bargain over wages and benefits, but we're also going to use our power as workers to fight for things that are of broader social value. So teachers fighting to tax fossil fuels and better fund education, or the Chicago Teachers Union fighting for how the city treats their unhoused students, or the SEIU local doing what some people called the first ever climate strike, fighting for green cleaning materials and stronger sexual harassment policies and better sick leave. So I think those kinds of fights are ways that you tie, bread and butter labor struggles, which you can't ever forget, wages and benefits, but with things that are more socially transformative.
I mean, reparations, baby bonds, a federal job guarantee are good for labor and good for people, and that should be good for what labor unions are interested in. But in the conversations with reparations, we also need that full-throated history to recognize the role that labor unions themselves have played in racial stratification and the reparative work that needs to be done there as well.
So I was going to ask one more question before we wrap up, which is, how should we unpack the concept of racial capitalism? Is one of the basic insights that racial domination emerges as a historical necessity in the maintenance of capitalist exploitation? Or are there other ways to unpack this notion? Anyone can start.
I'll take a shot. So the short answer is, it depends on what you mean by necessity. So here's the long answer. A lot of times people think that what you need to believe, to think about racial capitalism, to think that that's a good analysis, what you need to believe is that it's inconceivable that capitalism could exist without racism, right? So, by that standard, you're saying, no science fiction writer could write a novel where capitalism existed and racism didn't exist. And, that's clearly wrong, right? I think, people are very creative. We can imagine all sorts of shit, right? But that's not helpful to me. What's helpful to me is to look historically at how capitalism and racism have, in fact, related, and what possibilities that leaves open for future trends in capitalism and racial capitalism, as I would characterize it. And, as has been said by, I think, everybody at some point or other, the first few centuries or so of capitalism, the first few centuries or so of European colonial conquest of much of the world were just very explicitly racially organized, right? And we're talking through the majority of the 20th century, right? There were racial apartheid states, through much of the 20th century. So it's just, no one takes seriously that there wasn't, in fact, a tie between racism and capitalism. They argue about what to say the tie was. But I think we're dealing with the consequences of that. Even if you thought that, somehow magically, Michael Jackson's Black and White video came out and everybody was cured of racism, and it's just some pure historical thing that, some people used to be racist or whatever, that used to be historically important, whatever. Even if you just thought racism was in the past, we're talking about the congealed, accumulated results of centuries of history. That's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere whether or not the whole population changes their mind. And we know that they haven't. You look outside, racism hasn't gone anywhere if we're talking about attitudes. So I think what's important is that we recognize that racism and capitalism have come together, and that we recognize the functional role that racism has in keeping capitalism going. It prevents people from coming together across kinds of difference that they might otherwise overcome to work against the system. It keeps people invested in kinds of hierarchies that sustain the present economic order, right? So it keeps, it makes people do the comparison that I've been trying to argue people should stop doing. It says, you know, are non-Black people, are we as non-Black people better off under this system? Well, better off than Black people, but is that the comparison you should make? Racial capitalism will tell you to make that comparison, and I will tell you, don't do that. But you know, here we are. So racism and capitalism work together, and that they work together is what's important.
And I want to shout out, Femi, you have a great article in response to Michael Walzer in Dissent magazine, really unpacking racial capitalism. I think everyone should actually read that, but I hope that your next article goes into sci-fi, because that would be much more, you know, fun. And I think that I'm also used to getting some great sci-fi questions when talking about reparations, and maybe I'll make a film about it. I don't know.
Please do.
I mean, I'll say that, and you know, one part I'll disagree with you, Femi, on is that everybody knows this. I think that's the biggest obstacle, that we don't know this, and we don't say it. To me, that's the game changer. I think the game changer is when people realize that the third pillar in the relationship of economic and political consolidation is racial stratification. If we could get an understanding from progressives of that, then the solutions, the approaches will create new structures that might not be vulnerable to that divisive colonialism that always is the backlash when we make progress. So, you know, the last thing I'll say is that the iterative consolidation and concentration of capital and politics necessitates some subaltern group that can be naturalized as othered. And in the American context, it's Black people.
Thank you for that. Okay, so our time is up. I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in bringing this event together. First and foremost, our panelists, Darrick Hamilton, Femi Táíwò, and Simone Baptiste. Thank you so much, as well as you and our audience who will be receiving follow-up emails about upcoming events. Thank you for your great questions and comments, and thank you for our panelists for giving such thoughtful answers. And thanks to everyone who you can't see, who has been working from behind the scenes, not just on tonight's event, but for all the monthly events from May until today. It's been a great series of discussions that have worked hard to bring, that we've worked hard to bring together. So Sunshine, Letter, Michael Bennett, David DeHolde, Michael Grachowski, Claudia Cahill, Priscilla Yaverino from the Democratic Socialists of America Fund, Flynn Murray from Dissent magazine, and Emily Janakiram from the New Press. The book, We Own the Future, which is here, lays out several possible blueprints for a socialist future. And we want to thank you for everyone for helping us to build this future together. So with that, I'll say good night, everyone.